Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the disturbing cold case of Rita Curran. We will, of course, be going over some pretty messed up materials, so viewer discretion is advised. Without further ado, let's get into the case. Rita Curran. The case of Rita Curran is a very brutal one, with police unknowingly coming into contact with the culprit numerous times. Despite that, they were able to remain undetected for over 5 decades before ultimately being identified with a cigarette butt. Rita was 24 years old when she was tragically murdered in her apartment in Burlington, Vermont, in the summer of 1971. At 1:30 a.m., the Burlington Police Department was notified by the fire department's ambulance crew of a woman that seemed to have been murdered. When police arrived, they confirmed that the young woman was deceased. Rita was living with 3 other roommates at the time: 24-year-old Beverly Lanfer, 19-year-old Carrie Duane, and 23-year-old Paul Robinson. Beverly told police that she and Rita shared a room. Beverly also said that she had been out late that night and upon opening the bedroom door, she discovered Rita lying motionless on the ground with a heavily beaten face. Beverly then screamed out to her other roommates before contacting the medical center emergency room, telling them that she believed there was a dead person in the residence. It took about 3 hours for the medical examiners to finish inspecting the body. Dr. Harris reported that Rita was found on her back with her arms outstretched and her lower body propped up with her legs spread open. Rita's head was tilted left and badly beaten with numerous contusions and bruises covered in dried blood. It also appeared that strands of Rita's hair had been pulled out in the scuffle. There were also bruises along the inside of her leg but none on her neck or torso. Furthermore, Rita was wearing a buttoned-up housecoat that looked to have been forcefully ripped open, with several buttons strewn about on the floor. Her nightgown was entirely ripped and hung underneath her shoulder area. Her underwear was ripped from her body and located underneath her left leg. The culprit had somehow snuck into the room while Rita was lying down, where the two had a vicious fight on the side of the bed. The official cause of death was manual strangulation, and obviously, she was deceased around 7 a.m. The same day, officers began questioning the other residents who lived in the 3-story apartment complex. One of the residents who lived on the 3rd floor had said that they stayed up until around 1 a.m. but did not hear any unusual noises at the time. The officer obtained similar statements from other residents that he visited. The 2 roommates, Paul and Carrie, later told another officer that they had returned to the apartment around 12:30 a.m. and hung out in the living room for a while before returning to their bedroom when Rita's body was still being inspected. Inside the apartment, investigators located a Lark brand cigarette butt which was tucked underneath Rita's right elbow. The cigarette looked to have gone out naturally, with a small pile of ash laying around it. Investigators then asked the roommates if anyone smoked, and all of them said no. Police reported that there was no sign that the culprit had gone through the yard. The lead detective advised that everyone give the porch area a thorough search as there may be blood left behind from the intense struggle. Neither the porch nor the driveway yielded significant leads, though the porch had a gray trash can which had been knocked over with the contents spread out on the ground. So, most people likely suspect that one of, if not several of the roommates were responsible. Carrie said that both Paul and herself left the apartment just before 9 p.m. in order to get dinner. Beverly then decided to join the pair around 11:20 p.m., and she was the last person to see Rita alive who was in the apartment at the time. Once Beverly met up with Carrie and Paul, Paul said that he was beginning to feel tired, so he and Carrie decided to head back while Beverly stayed out. Carrie and Paul got to the apartment around 12:30 a.m. and didn't notice anything strange, but they did say that the door to Rita and Beverly's room was opened by about 12 inches. Nevertheless, they didn't give it a second thought. The detectives suspect that Rita was murdered sometime after Beverly left the apartment and before Carrie and Paul returned. All of the roommates reported that their actions that night were spontaneous, and they did not schedule anything ahead of time. In 2019, Detective Tree was tasked with reopening the case, and he said that it was highly unlikely that this murder was a random chance encounter. The culprit only had about an hour to realize that Rita was the only one home, take her life, and then escape before the roommates returned. Tree was quoted saying, "It is probable that the suspect lived in close proximity where he would have a knowledge of who was home and when. He would have known who lived at the apartment and what vehicles they drove." So if you remember earlier, I mentioned that the officers went around the apartment to ask other residents if they had heard anything the night of Rita's death. While one of the residents was named William Darris, who lived on the third floor, police contacted William over 3 times, and he was also mentioned several times by other residents saying that he was somewhat suspicious. But both he and his wife had solid alibis, which said that they were at home the entire night. One of the officers' reports said Mrs. Darris stated that she heard nothing and saw nothing, and as far as she knew, neither did her husband on the night of Monday, July 19, 1971. William himself was never designated as a person of interest, and so he was never formally investigated, but due to his location, he was added to the pool of people to test DNA against once the case was reopened. Rita's fingernail scrapings as well as vaginal slides were sent to the New York City office of the chief medical examiners for testing. In about a month's time, a male DNA profile was generated with the cigarette butt that we mentioned earlier. About half of the slides that were sent were deemed to have insufficient DNA for testing, but the fingernail scrapings were still being examined. So, while that was being done, investigators took that DNA profile and began forming a list of suspects, which actually included Ted Bundy, but he was later eliminated from the list. All of Rita's roommates, as well as the first responders, also had their DNA tested against the profile, but they were all ruled out from possibly being the culprit. In 2022, that cigarette butt was sent to Parabon Nanolabs. In addition to that, the company representatives asked for the list of people who had been ruled out as the culprit, and that William Darris, that we talked about earlier, was not on the list at first. But later on, Detective Tree decided to add him back due to a gut feeling he had. Parabon later stated that William was a high-confidence match with genetic matches on both the maternal and paternal sides of the family. However, William died in 1986 from a morphine overdose, and his remains were cremated. Additionally, there was no biological evidence left behind that could be tested, but fortunately, they were able to locate a half-brother of William's and test the DNA against him. This test did confirm a familial relation. With this new revelation, authorities tracked down William's ex-wife, Michelle, who I believe has since changed her name to Kylie's. They also visited all of Rita's former roommates, but by this time, Beverly had already passed away. In the 2022 interview with Michelle, she stated that William had never been physically abusive towards her and that she couldn't remember why she had broken up with William in the first place. Michelle informed the investigators that she didn't know who Rita was, and on the night that she was murdered, both herself and William got into an argument. Following that, William said he was going on a cool-down walk and left the apartment. Michelle added that she couldn't recall how long William had stepped out for as she went to bed immediately after he left. Michelle claimed that she couldn't remember a lot of the details from that night since it was so long ago, but she did remember opening up her eyes to see William sleeping next to her at some point late into the night. In this interview, we also learned that William was a smoker. Furthermore, after he and Michelle had separated, William moved to Thailand to become a monk, which I believe he failed at. Around this time, William also got into another relationship, but this did not last long. In conclusion, due to the results of extensive DNA testing, the Burlington Police Department is more or less certain that William Darris is the sole perpetrator in Rita Curran's murder.